Hello everyone, and welcome back to Spooky Hut. I know many of you listen to these videos to help you fall asleep, so before you doze off, it would be great if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. If you're enjoying the episodes, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Now let's get cozy, relax, and get started. My name is Robert Fisher, and I live in the quiet town of Arrowhead, California. I was 35 when this incident happened to me, and to this day, I still feel a cold chill every time I drive past that cursed lake. I was on my way from a friend's cabin in the San Bernardino Mountains, heading back to my home in Arrowhead. It was late October, and the air had that sharp bite of the impending winter. I had taken the old road that cut past Lake Gregory, a secluded lake surrounded by thick woods. Little did I know, this would be the night that changed how I viewed the world around me forever. I had heard local legends about the lake, whispers of strange disappearances, eerie lights at night, and stories of people seeing figures rise from the water. I never believed any of it. I'm a practical man. Ghost stories and folklore never meant much to me, but after what I experienced that night, I can't unsee what I saw, and I'll never forget the suffocating sense of dread that gripped me. I had left my friend's cabin around 7 p.m., thinking I'd have just enough daylight to make the drive before dark. But as luck would have it, my car broke down about halfway down the mountain. By the time I got it going again, the sun had already dipped below the horizon. The road was empty, and the woods on either side seemed to swallow the last rays of light. Fog began to roll in off the lake, thick and heavy, wrapping around the trees like ghostly tendrils. It wasn't long before I felt like I was driving through a tunnel of mist, with only my headlights cutting a narrow path through the gloom. I don't know what made me stop. Maybe it was the strange movement I saw through the fog, or perhaps it was the overwhelming sensation that I wasn't alone. Either way, I pulled over at a small clearing just by the edge of the lake, the engine of my car rumbling as I left it idling. The fog clung to everything, swirling over the water like a living thing, and there, in the midst of that dense haze, I saw something, or someone. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, the way the mist seemed to shape itself into human-like forms, but the longer I stared, the more certain I became. There was a figure standing at the edge of the lake, just a few yards from where I had stopped. They didn't move. They just stood there, facing the water, their back turned toward me. Something about them seemed off. The way they stood so perfectly still, so rigid, like a statue. I called out, "Hey, you okay?" but got no response. The silence around me was absolute, broken only by the faint sound of the lake lapping against the shore. I got out of the car, against my better judgment, and walked toward the figure. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if something was pulling me back, urging me to leave, to get in my car and drive away. But I couldn't. Curiosity, or perhaps some darker force, pushed me forward. As I got closer, the figure still didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence. I was about 10 feet away when the fog parted slightly, and I saw more clearly. It was a woman. She was dressed in an old-fashioned white gown, soaked through with water. Her long dark hair hung limply over her shoulders, and her skin was pale, almost bluish. She wasn't standing on solid ground. She was standing in the water, submerged up to her knees. A sudden, overwhelming sense of dread hit me like a wave. My instincts screamed at me to turn around, to run, but I couldn't take my eyes off her. Then, without warning, she turned. Her eyes. God, I'll never forget her eyes. They were sunken and black, completely void of life. Her face was gaunt, almost skeletal, and her lips were cracked and blue. She opened her mouth as if to scream, but no sound came out. Instead, a gurgling, choking noise echoed from deep within her throat, as though her lungs were filled with water. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. I had never been so terrified in my life, but before I could turn and run, I heard movement in the water, more splashing. I glanced to my left and saw them. More figures, rising up from the depths of the lake. They were all drenched, their clothes clinging to their emaciated bodies, their faces pale and hollow. Some were missing eyes, others had grotesque wounds, but they all shared the same haunting, dead gaze. There must have been a dozen of them, maybe more, slowly wading toward the shore, their dead eyes fixed on me. My body froze. My mind raced, but I couldn't move. It was as if the air around me had thickened, like I was sinking into the fog itself. The woman in white took a step toward me, her feet gliding over the water's surface. She raised her hand slowly, beckoning me to come closer. I felt an unnatural pull, as though some invisible force was trying to drag me toward the lake, toward her. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I felt myself slipping away, my mind fading into the fog. It was only the sharp pain of a rock digging into my palm that jolted me back to reality. I had fallen, and that simple physical sensation brought me back just enough to snap out of the trance. I scrambled to my feet, not daring to look back. I could hear the splashing of water behind me, getting louder, closer. I ran to my car, threw myself into the driver's seat, and slammed the door shut. My hands were shaking so badly that I fumbled with the keys, but somehow, I managed to start the engine. I floored the gas pedal and sped away, my heart pounding in my ears, the fog swallowing the figures behind me. For weeks, I tried to rationalize what I had seen, but no explanation made sense. I wasn't hallucinating, I wasn't dreaming, and I wasn't losing my mind. I had seen them, the dead, rising from the lake. I later found out that Lake Gregory had a dark history. During the 1940s and 50s, there had been a series of drownings, most of them never explained. Some bodies were recovered, but others were never found. The locals don't talk about it, but there are whispers. People say the souls of the drowned linger in the lake, trapped, rising from the depths on foggy nights like the one I experienced. I don't drive past Lake Gregory anymore. I take the long way home, even if it adds an extra hour to my trip. I've never told anyone this story until now, but the memories of that night haunt me still. The woman in white, the figures rising from the water. What were they? Spirits? Lost souls? I don't know. But I do know this. Something is wrong with that lake. It's not just water. It's something much darker, much older, and whatever it is, it's still there, waiting for anyone foolish enough to stop and look too closely. I'll never forget the way they looked at me, their eyes empty, their faces twisted in silent screams. They weren't just the dead. They were something far worse, something that should never be disturbed. And I had disturbed them. My name is Charles Dawson, and I've lived my whole life in a small town called Timber Brook, Oregon. I was 42 years old when it happened, when I made the mistake of walking down the old road. It's been years now, but the memory of that night still keeps me awake. A feeling of unease crawling under my skin whenever I think about it. Timber Brook is a quiet town, nestled between vast stretches of dense forest and hills that seem to close in around you the deeper you go. There's only one main road leading out of town, but there's an old dirt road, a forgotten one, that cuts through the forest like a jagged scar. Nobody uses it anymore, and for good reason. The old road was once a shortcut to a mining town about 20 miles away, but it had been abandoned for decades. Over time, stories grew around it. Tales of people going missing, strange sounds in the woods at night, and sightings of figures lurking just beyond the tree line. They called it cursed, though most people just called it bad luck. The locals all knew the stories, but nobody talked about it openly. It was one of those things you didn't acknowledge out loud, like an unspoken rule. That October night, I was coming back from a late shift at the lumber yard. I'd had a long day, and my mind wasn't exactly clear. My usual route home was blocked off for road repairs, and I had two options. Take the highway, which would take another hour, or cut through the old road and be home in 20 minutes. I remember sitting in my truck at the crossroads, the sky dark and heavy with rain clouds. The thought of taking that road made me feel uneasy, but I was tired, and I just wanted to get home. Against my better judgment, I made the turn. The road was barely visible under the overgrowth and fallen leaves. Trees loomed on either side like walls, the branches thick and twisted, blocking out what little light remained. My headlights cut through the mist that was starting to gather in the cool night air. As I drove, the dirt road beneath my tires felt rough and uneven, making the truck bounce and rattle. The further I went, the more isolated I felt, as if the world outside had slipped away, leaving only the road and the suffocating darkness. About 10 minutes in, my truck started to sputter. I cursed under my breath as the engine choked, stalling out completely. Great, just what I needed. I tried the ignition again, but it wouldn't start. I wasn't far from town, maybe a 5-mile walk, but the idea of walking that road on foot didn't sit well with me. Still, I didn't have much choice. I grabbed my flashlight, locked the truck, and started walking. The silence was oppressive. No wind, no crickets, not even the rustle of leaves, just the crunch of my boots on the gravel. Every now and then, I would hear something in the woods, a faint rustling or a snap of a twig. But when I shone my flashlight in that direction, there was nothing. I kept telling myself it was just animals, maybe deer or raccoons. But the further I walked, the more the atmosphere seemed to shift. It was as if the air had gotten thicker, colder, like the road itself was alive and breathing around me. I don't know how to explain it, but I began to feel like I was being watched. The sensation grew stronger with every step, an instinctual fear crawling up my spine. I glanced over my shoulder more times than I could count, half expecting to see someone, or something, following me. But the road was always empty. Still, the feeling wouldn't go away. Then I saw something up ahead, just outside the beam of my flashlight. A figure. My heart skipped a beat. It was standing in the middle of the road, motionless. I stopped dead in my tracks, my pulse hammering in my ears. I couldn't make out any details at first, just the outline of a person. But something about the way they stood wasn't right. They were too still, too rigid, like they weren't alive. I pointed my flashlight directly at them, but as soon as the light touched the figure, they disappeared, just gone, as if they had never been there. I stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I tried to rationalize it, convincing myself it was a trick of the light, or maybe my mind playing games with me. But deep down, I knew better. I knew that whatever I had just seen wasn't natural. I picked up the pace, my feet moving faster, but the feeling of being watched intensified. It wasn't just one set of eyes. I felt surrounded, like there were dozens of unseen figures lurking in the trees, just out of sight, following my every move. The air grew colder, and with it, the fog began to roll in, thick and suffocating, swirling around my legs and obscuring the road ahead. Then I heard it. Footsteps. They weren't mine. They were slow, deliberate, and they echoed behind me, matching my pace. I didn't dare look back. I broke into a run, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I sprinted down the road. The footsteps quickened, closing in on me, and I could feel their presence like cold hands reaching for me. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, my lungs burning and my legs aching, but no matter how fast I went, the footsteps stayed close behind. I didn't stop until I saw the faint glow of a street lamp in the distance, marking the outskirts of Timberbrook. I stumbled into the light, gasping for breath, my body trembling. The footsteps stopped as soon as I reached the light, and when I finally gathered the courage to turn around, there was nothing there, just the empty road stretching back into the fog. I made it home that night, but I never felt the same again. The next morning, I went to retrieve my truck, but when I got to the spot where I had broken down, the truck wasn't there. The road looked different, older somehow, like it hadn't been used in years. I checked with the local tow company, thinking maybe someone had towed it in the night, but they had no record of it. It was as if the truck had vanished along with whatever had been chasing me. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something from that road had followed me back. I would wake up in the middle of the night, convinced that I heard footsteps outside my house, or see fleeting shadows at the edge of my vision. I even started to see that figure, the one I saw on the road, standing at the far end of my yard, just watching. It never moved, never came closer, but it was always there, a silent reminder of that night. I haven't walked down that old road again, and I never will. Locals still tell stories about it, how people go missing, or how some say they've seen figures walking the road late at night, only to disappear into the fog. I don't know what's out there, or what I encountered that night, but I do know one thing. There's a reason nobody walks down that road anymore. Whatever lurks in the shadows of those woods isn't human, and it's still waiting for anyone foolish enough to wander down that cursed path. So if you ever find yourself near Timberbrook, and you come across that old dirt road, do yourself a favor, turn around. My name is James Weston, and I live in Springfield, Missouri. I was 35 when it happened, when I first saw them. I'd heard of shadow people before, but I'd always written them off as urban legends or tricks of the mind. You know, those fleeting figures you think you see out of the corner of your eye, only for them to vanish when you turn your head. I didn't believe in any of that. Not until I started seeing them myself. Now, I wish I'd never doubted it. It all started about a year ago, right after I moved into an old house just on the outskirts of town. I'd bought it at a bargain price, a fixer-upper with a lot of potential. It had this eerie, worn-down charm that appealed to me, nestled among the trees, far from the noise of the city. I'm not superstitious, but from the moment I stepped inside, I felt off. It wasn't just the creaking floorboards or the way the wind seemed to howl louder in that house than anywhere else. It was something deeper, like the air itself was heavy with a presence I couldn't explain. At first, the sightings were small things. I'd be sitting in my living room, watching TV or reading a book, when I'd catch a glimpse of something moving just outside my peripheral vision. I'd turn, expecting to see an animal, or maybe a tree branch swaying in the wind, but there'd be nothing there. Just the empty hallway or the darkened corners of the room. I brushed it off, my mind playing tricks on me. It happens when you're tired, right? But then it got worse. One night, about 3 months after I moved in, I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep. The house was dead quiet, except for the occasional creak from the old wooden beams settling. My bedroom faced the backyard, where there was nothing but trees and darkness. I had my back to the window, drifting in and out of sleep, when I felt it. The unmistakable sensation of being watched. I opened my eyes, and there it was. A figure. A tall, shadowy figure standing at the foot of my bed. It didn't have any distinguishable features. No face, no eyes, just a dark silhouette, darker than the shadows in the room. It was as if the figure was made of pure darkness, standing there, motionless, staring at me. My body froze, fear gripping me in a way I'd never experienced before. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. All I could do was stare back, my heart pounding in my chest. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. I sat up in bed, gasping for air, my skin cold and clammy. I turned on the lamp beside my bed, but there was nothing, no sign that anyone had been there. My bedroom door was still shut, and the window was locked from the inside. I told myself it was a nightmare, maybe sleep paralysis, though I'd never experienced it before. But deep down, I knew better. That thing, whatever it was, had been real. I'd seen it. I'd felt it. Over the next few weeks, I saw it again and again. Sometimes it would be in the hallway, just standing there, watching me as I walked past. Other times it would be outside, near the tree line, barely visible but unmistakable against the dim glow of the porch light. It never moved, never made a sound. It just stood there, like it was waiting for something. The worst part was, it wasn't alone. One night, after another sighting, I decided to stay up late, determined to catch it, or them, in the act. I sat in the living room, the lights dimmed, my eyes glued to the front door. I waited for hours, staring into the dark corners of the house, my nerves on edge. It must have been around 3 a.m. when I saw them. Not just one, but 3 figures. 3 shadow people, standing in the doorway to the kitchen. They didn't move. They didn't need to. Their presence filled the room with a suffocating sense of dread. I stood up, shaking, my body numb with fear. The figures didn't react. I took a step forward, flashlight in hand, but as soon as the beam touched them, they vanished, disappearing into the darkness like they had never been there at all. I was left standing in the middle of the living room, my flashlight trembling in my hand, feeling more alone than I ever had in my life. I started researching shadow people after that, trying to find out what I was dealing with. The stories were all similar: dark figures that appear in your home, watching, following, but never directly interacting. Some said they were spirits, others claimed they were entities from another dimension. The most common theory was that they fed off fear, growing stronger the more terrified you became. That part resonated with me because every time I saw them, the fear was worse. It was like they were slowly breaking me down, chipping away at my sanity piece by piece. One night, things escalated. I was asleep in my bed, the covers pulled tightly around me. It had been a few days since I'd last seen the shadow people, and I was starting to think maybe, just maybe, they had left. But then, I woke up to the feeling of something cold brushing against my face. My eyes snapped open, and there, looming over me, was a shadow figure. This one was different, closer, more oppressive. It was leaning down over me, its featureless face mere inches from mine. I could feel the cold radiating off of it, an unnatural chill that seeped into my bones. I tried to move, but my body was paralyzed with fear. I couldn't breathe, couldn't scream. The figure lingered for what felt like an eternity, its presence crushing me with an unbearable weight. And then it leaned in closer, its shadowy form pressing down on my chest. I couldn't take it anymore. I managed to let out a strangled gasp, and just like that, it was gone. The next morning, I packed a bag and left the house. I didn't care where I went. I just needed to get away. I stayed at a hotel in town for a few days, trying to convince myself I wasn't going crazy. But the truth was undeniable. The house was haunted, or cursed, or something worse. And it wasn't safe. I put the house up for sale the following week. I didn't tell the real estate agent about the shadow people. I knew she wouldn't believe me. But every time I had to go back to pack up my belongings, I could feel them. I never saw them again directly, but their presence was always there, lurking in the corners, watching me, waiting. I moved out of Springfield not long after. I couldn't stay there, knowing that the shadow people were still out there waiting for someone else to walk into that house. Sometimes late at night, I wonder if they're still watching me. Even now, miles away from that cursed place, I still feel their eyes on me. So if you ever see a dark figure out of the corner of your eye, don't ignore it. Don't write it off as your imagination playing tricks on you. Because once you notice them, they notice you too. And once they do, they don't go away. Not ever. Trust me, I learned that the hard way. My name is Alex Calloway, and I live in Missoula, Montana. I was 34 when this incident happened to me, and I still can't shake the feeling of dread that comes over me every time I think about it. I had been planning a weekend trip to visit my old college friend Steve, who had recently moved to a cabin deep in the woods of the Flathead National Forest, just north of Kalispell. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend away from work, the city, and all the noise that came with it. What I experienced instead haunts me to this day, a creeping terror I wish I could forget. I can still feel the unease as I left Missoula, heading toward Steve's cabin. There was an odd feeling in the pit of my stomach, even as I packed my bag. I chalked it up to stress, or maybe just the anticipation of driving through the dense, isolated woods. I wasn't a huge fan of remote places, but Steve had been raving about the peace and beauty of his new home. He claimed it was perfect for unwinding and clearing the mind. Little did I know, That would be the last thing I would experience in those woods. The drive up was uneventful at first. The familiar landscape of Montana stretched out before me, rolling hills, forests as far as the eye could see, and the occasional glimpse of the mountains. But as I got closer to the cabin, the sky grew darker, not from the setting sun, but from thick rolling clouds that seemed to form out of nowhere. A storm was brewing, and I felt a sense of urgency to get to Steve's place before the weather hit. I called him to check in, but his phone went straight to voicemail. That wasn't unusual, considering the cabin was in a remote area with spotty cell service. Still, something about it unnerved me, and that uneasy feeling in my gut tightened. By the time I turned off the main road and onto the narrow dirt path that led to Steve's cabin, the wind had picked up, and a fine drizzle began to patter against my windshield. The trees seemed to close in on the road, their branches swaying ominously in the wind, casting strange, shifting shadows on the ground. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, it was a relief to see the place intact, though it looked a lot older and more worn than Steve had described. The wood was weathered and gray, and the windows seemed dark, almost like eyes watching me. I grabbed my bag and headed toward the front door, but I noticed something odd as I approached. There were no lights on inside. Steve had said he would be there all day getting things ready, but it looked as though no one was home. I knocked on the door, calling out his name, but there was no answer. The storm was intensifying, and I didn't want to be stuck outside, so I tried the door. It creaked open with little effort, the hinges groaning as if they hadn't been oiled in years. The inside was just as dark as it looked from the outside, but the dim light from the storm clouds outside cast enough glow for me to see the interior. The cabin was small and sparsely furnished, just a couch, a small table, and a fireplace. It smelled damp, like the place hadn't been aired out in a while. "Steve?" I called again, but there was no response. I checked my phone, but there was no service. I was about to head back outside to see if I could get a signal when I heard a noise upstairs. It was faint, like the sound of something dragging across the floor. I froze, listening carefully. Maybe Steve was just messing with me, playing some prank to scare me. It wouldn't have been out of character for him, but something about the sound didn't feel right. I slowly made my way up the narrow staircase, the old wood creaking under my weight. The air grew colder with each step, and the noise became clearer, more distinct. It wasn't dragging. It was scratching, like something sharp scraping against wood. My heart was pounding as I reached the top of the stairs and stood in the narrow hallway. There were 2 doors, one at each end, both closed. The scratching was coming from the room on the left. I called out again, my voice shaky now, but there was still no response. I don't know what possessed me to keep going, but I stepped toward the door and slowly turned the knob. The door creaked open, revealing a small bedroom. The window was slightly open and the wind was making the curtains flutter, but that wasn't the source of the noise. It was coming from the floor, no, under the floor. I crouched down and pressed my ear against the old wooden planks, and that's when I heard it clearly, a rhythmic, deliberate scratching, like something, or someone, was trying to claw its way up from beneath the house. I stumbled back, my breath caught in my throat. Panic surged through me and I rushed out of the room, slamming the door behind me. I had to get out of that cabin. I flew down the stairs, my mind racing, trying to figure out what was happening. But as I reached the bottom, I stopped dead in my tracks. The front door, which I had left ajar, was now closed. The room felt even colder, and the air had taken on a strange, oppressive quality. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. I turned toward the door to leave, but before I could take a step, the scratching started again, this time louder and closer, like it was right beneath my feet. Then came the voice. It was faint at first, barely a whisper, but unmistakable. "Help. Me." The words echoed through the cabin, chilling me to the bone. It was coming from below the floorboards, from whatever was underneath the house. I couldn't move. I felt rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. My mind was screaming at me to leave, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. Suddenly the room went dark. The storm outside had blotted out what little light there was, and I was plunged into total darkness. I fumbled for my phone, the dim glow of the screen the only source of light. I turned on the flashlight and pointed it toward the floor, but as soon as the beam hit the wooden planks, I saw it. A hand, pale and thin, reaching up through a crack in the floorboards. I screamed and bolted for the door, throwing it open and running out into the storm. The rain was pouring down in sheets now, and the wind howled through the trees, but I didn't care. I ran to my car, jumped in, and peeled out of there as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, my heart still racing, my mind struggling to comprehend what I had just seen. I tried calling Steve again, but still no answer. I couldn't bring myself to go back to that cabin, so I drove to the nearest town and found a motel. I spent the night there, unable to sleep, my mind replaying the events over and over. The next morning, I drove back to the cabin, hoping to find Steve and some rational explanation for what had happened. When I arrived, the cabin was gone. I know how that sounds, but I swear it's the truth. The cabin was just gone. The dirt path I had driven down the day before was overgrown with weeds, like no one had used it in years. There was no sign that a cabin had ever been there, just an empty clearing surrounded by trees. I called the local authorities, but they couldn't find any records of a cabin at that location. Steve's phone was disconnected, and no one had heard from him. It's been years since that day, and I still don't know what happened. All I know is that something was in that cabin, something that wasn't human, and it's still out there, waiting. My name is Martin Vance, and I live in Spokane, Washington. I was 42 years old when this incident happened, and to this day, I still don't understand what I saw. This was back in the summer of 2015, and I had just taken a break from my job as a real estate agent to spend some time exploring the remote areas of Washington state. I've always been fascinated by old ghost towns and abandoned places where history seems to be frozen in time. But what I encountered on that trip was something I never could have imagined, and it haunts me even now, years later. It started as a regular weekend road trip. I had heard rumors from an old acquaintance about a forgotten town deep in the Cascades, one that wasn't on any modern map. He didn't have much to go on, just vague directions and a name, Prosperity. I couldn't find any information on it, which intrigued me even more. A town lost to time, shrouded in mystery, miles away from civilization. It sounded like the perfect place to explore. I packed my gear, loaded up my SUV, and set out, thinking it would be just another ghost town to add to my growing list of abandoned places I'd visited. The drive started off peacefully enough, the winding roads taking me through dense forests and past serene rivers. It was early afternoon when I finally left the main road and followed an old gravel trail into the wilderness. The deeper I went, the more the trees seemed to close in, towering over the path like silent sentinels. My GPS lost signal within an hour, leaving me to rely on the directions scribbled on a piece of paper. I was supposed to turn left at an old logging road, but the landmarks I had been told to look for were vague. A broken tree, an old stone marker. As I drove further, it became clear this place wasn't visited often. The road became more difficult to navigate, with weeds and roots overtaking what was once a path. Every so often, I'd get the uneasy feeling that I was being watched, though I hadn't seen another person or vehicle for hours. I brushed it off as paranoia. After all, I was in the middle of nowhere. There couldn't possibly be anyone out here. It was late afternoon by the time I found what appeared to be the entrance to the town. The trail opened up into a clearing, and there, just ahead, were the remnants of an old wooden sign, weathered and broken. I could barely make out the faded letters, Prosperity. Finally, I had arrived. What struck me first was how intact everything was. The buildings were old, sure, many were falling apart, with roofs caved in and windows shattered, but it didn't have the same feel as other ghost towns I'd visited. There was an eerie stillness here, a heaviness in the air that made my skin crawl. It was as if the town had been abandoned in a hurry. I parked my SUV near what looked like an old general store and stepped out, taking in the surroundings. The place wasn't large, maybe 10 or 15 buildings in total, but there was something odd about the layout. It didn't seem planned, like the town had just sprung up without any thought to its design. Houses and stores were scattered haphazardly, some built far too close to each other, others standing in isolation at odd angles. It didn't feel right. As I walked through the main street, I noticed something else. There were no sounds. No birds, no wind rustling through the trees. Nothing. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the crunch of my boots on the gravel. I pulled out my camera to document the place, but as soon as I raised it to take a picture, it powered down. Dead battery. I cursed under my breath. It had been fully charged before I left. Frustrated, I stowed it back in my bag and continued exploring. There was something unsettling about the state of the town. It wasn't just abandoned. It felt like it had been forgotten, erased from memory. The houses were mostly empty, their contents long since decayed, but there were strange remnants left behind. In one house, I found a table set for dinner, plates and utensils still in place, though covered in dust and grime. In another, a child's room with toys scattered across the floor, untouched for what looked like decades. It was as if the people who had lived here had simply vanished, leaving everything behind. The strangest part was the church. It stood at the far end of town, its steeple leaning precariously to one side. Unlike the other buildings, it seemed almost untouched by time. The windows were intact, the door still closed. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached, feeling a sense of dread growing in my chest with every step. The door creaked open easily, and I stepped inside. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of decay. The pews were lined up neatly, facing the altar, and the floor was covered in a fine layer of dust. But as I walked further into the church, I noticed something odd. The dust wasn't uniform. There were footprints, leading from the entrance toward the altar and then stopping abruptly as if whoever made them had disappeared. I followed the tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached the altar, I stopped. There, lying on the ground in front of me, was a small wooden box, no bigger than a shoebox. It looked new, out of place in the decrepit church. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't resist. I knelt down and opened it. Inside was a collection of old photographs, yellowed with age. They were images of the town, but something was wrong. In the photos, the town was alive, bustling with people, but the faces were all wrong. They were blurred, distorted, as if the camera had captured something it shouldn't have. The people in the photographs seemed to be screaming, their mouths wide open in silent horror, though the rest of their bodies appeared calm, almost relaxed. It was as if they had been caught in the moment they realized something terrible was happening. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I whipped around, but there was no one there. My heart raced as I backed away from the altar, knocking over the box in the process. The photos spilled out onto the floor, and that's when I saw it. My face, staring back at me from one of the photographs, standing in the very spot I was now. My mouth wide open in that same silent scream. I ran. I don't remember how I made it out of the church or back to my SUV. My body was running on pure adrenaline, my mind barely able to comprehend what I had just seen. I jumped in the car, gunned the engine, and sped out of the town as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I was back on the main road, miles away from that cursed place. When I finally calmed down enough to think clearly, I pulled over and tried to call someone, anyone, to tell them what had happened. But my phone had no signal, and when I tried turning on my camera again, it worked, but the memory card was completely wiped. There was no evidence that I had ever been there. I drove straight back to Spokane, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I had experienced. The next day, I tried to find any records of the town, but there was nothing. No mention of prosperity anywhere. It was as if the town had never existed. I even contacted a few historians and local experts, but none of them had ever heard of it. To this day, I don't know what I saw. Maybe it was some kind of hallucination, a trick of the mind brought on by isolation and fear. Or maybe, just maybe, I had stumbled upon something that wasn't meant to be found. All I know is that town, that forgotten place, had vanished without a trace, leaving behind nothing but the terror etched into my memory. And I will never go back. My name is Nathan Brooks, and I live in a quiet town just outside Salem, Massachusetts. I was 39 years old when I experienced something that changed the way I look at the world forever. I've always been a skeptic, the type of person who didn't believe in the supernatural. Ghosts, demons, and haunted houses were just stories told to scare kids. Or so I thought. But what I encountered in the fall of 2017 shattered that belief. And I've never been the same since. I was working as a contractor remodeling old homes around New England when I got a call from a real estate agent I occasionally did work for. She had a house in Danvers that had been on the market for years but hadn't sold. It was an old colonial, built in the 1700s, and it was in serious disrepair. My job was to assess the property, make a few necessary repairs, and clean it up to make it more appealing to potential buyers. It seemed like a straightforward enough project, and I agreed to start the following week. When I arrived at the house, I immediately felt uneasy. It was the kind of unease that's hard to describe. A feeling deep in your gut that something is wrong, even though everything appears normal. The house sat on a large plot of land, isolated from the nearby town. The trees surrounding it seemed to press in from all sides, casting long shadows over the yard. The air was thick and still, almost too quiet. I chalked it up to the overgrown nature of the property and the fact that I was alone in the middle of nowhere. As I walked up to the front door, I noticed something strange. All the windows were covered in grime, as if no one had touched them in years. The house had been abandoned for quite some time, but there was something about the state of the windows that bothered me. It was like the house didn't want to be seen, as though it was hiding itself from the outside world. I pushed the thought aside and unlocked the door, stepping inside. The interior was just as neglected as the outside. Dust coated every surface, and the air was musty, thick with the scent of rot and decay. I could hear the faint sound of the floor creaking beneath my feet as I walked through the front hall. It wasn't unusual for an old house like this, but something about the sound felt off, almost like it was responding to my presence. The first few hours went by without incident. I took notes on what needed to be fixed, the windows, the broken floorboards, the peeling wallpaper, and set up my tools in the front room. It was late afternoon when I decided to start repairing one of the old wooden doors that had warped with age. As I worked, I noticed a chill creeping into the room, even though it was a warm day outside. The temperature seemed to drop suddenly, and my breath became visible in the air. I paused, looking around for an explanation. There were no open windows or drafts that I could find. The chill seemed to come from nowhere. That's when I heard it. A faint, low whisper, almost too quiet to make out. At first I thought it was the wind, but there was no breeze. The sound was coming from somewhere in the house. I stood still, straining to listen. The whispering grew louder, though I couldn't understand the words. It was like a conversation just out of reach, voices murmuring in a language I didn't recognize. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I continued working, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger with every passing minute. I couldn't shake the sense that something was there with me, just out of sight, lurking in the shadows of the house. By the time the sun began to set, I had finished most of the work I planned for the day. I gathered my tools and headed upstairs to check the condition of the bedrooms. The upper floor was even more decayed than the rest of the house. The floorboards creaked loudly beneath my weight, and the walls were stained with water damage. As I approached the last room at the end of the hall, a wave of nausea hit me. It was sudden and overwhelming, as if the air itself had turned sour. The smell of sulfur filled my nose, and I had to cover my mouth to keep from gagging. I reached for the doorknob, and the moment my hand touched it, I felt a jolt of cold run through my body. It was as if the house itself didn't want me to open that door. But I had come this far, and I wasn't about to turn back now. I twisted the knob and pushed the door open. The room was completely empty, but the feeling inside was oppressive, suffocating. The air was thick, heavy with a presence I couldn't see but could feel pressing down on me from all sides. The temperature plummeted, and the whispers returned, louder this time, echoing through the room. I could make out faint shapes in the dark corners, flickering in and out of my vision like shadows that weren't quite there. Then, I saw it. In the far corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light, something moved. It was low to the ground, crawling on all fours, its limbs twisted and unnatural. At first I thought it was an animal, a raccoon or a stray dog that had somehow gotten inside. But as it emerged from the shadows, I realized it was nothing of this world. The creature's skin was pale and sickly, stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes were sunken and hollow, dark pits that seemed to stare straight into my soul. Its mouth was wide, filled with sharp, jagged teeth, and it grinned at me as it moved closer, its body contorting in unnatural ways. I froze, my mind unable to comprehend what I was seeing. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by fear. The creature stopped just a few feet away, its grin widening as it tilted its head, watching me. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now, and I realized they were coming from the creature itself. It was speaking, though I couldn't understand the words. They were ancient, guttural, and filled with malice. In a sudden burst of adrenaline, I managed to break free from my paralysis and bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind me. I didn't stop running until I was outside, the cold night air hitting me like a slap to the face. I jumped into my truck, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. I peeled out of the driveway and didn't stop driving until I reached a motel several miles away. That night, I barely slept. My mind kept replaying the image of that thing in the room, its hollow eyes and twisted body seared into my memory. I knew I couldn't go back to that house, not after what I had seen. The next morning, I called the real estate agent and told her I wouldn't be able to finish the job. I didn't give her any details. I didn't want her to think I was crazy, but she seemed to understand. She told me I wasn't the first contractor to walk off that job. Over the next few weeks, I tried to put the experience behind me, but strange things started happening. Objects in my home would move on their own, doors would slam shut without warning, and at night, I would wake up to the sound of whispering, the same voices I had heard in the house. I began to feel like I was being followed, that whatever I had encountered in that house had latched onto me. I reached out to a local historian, desperate for answers. She told me the house had a dark history. In the 1800s, it had been owned by a man named Samuel Ward, who was rumored to have been involved in occult practices. He had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and ever since, the house had been plagued by reports of strange occurrences. People who lived there would leave after just a few months, claiming the place was haunted by something far darker than a mere ghost. I've tried everything to rid myself of this presence, cleansings, prayers, even exorcisms, but nothing has worked. Whatever followed me from that house is still with me, lurking in the shadows, waiting. The whispers haven't stopped, and some nights when I'm lying in bed, I can feel the weight of something sitting at the foot of the mattress, watching me with hollow eyes. I don't know what it wants, but I fear one day I'll find out. And when that day comes, I may not survive to tell the story. My name is Marcus Wheeler, and I live in Miami, Florida. I was 31 years old when this incident happened to me, and even now, I still can't fully explain what occurred that day. It was supposed to be a simple trip. I was heading from Miami to Bermuda on a chartered sailboat with 3 friends. Our plan was to sail leisurely, enjoy the ocean, and maybe stop along the way to fish. But somewhere between the calm waters and endless horizon, something went terribly wrong. I've never felt fear like I did that night in the Bermuda Triangle, and I still wake up sweating, thinking about it. It was the summer of 2019 when the trip was planned. The four of us, me, Nate, Joseph, and Sam, had been close friends for years. Nate, who owned the boat, had suggested the trip as a way to unwind from our busy lives. At first, I was excited. I'd always heard the stories about the Bermuda Triangle, but I never believed in that kind of stuff. Planes and ships disappearing without a trace. It seemed like a bunch of conspiracy theories and exaggerated tales. But by the end of our trip, I realized those stories were much more than that. The first day was perfect. The sun was shining and the sea was calm. We had left Miami early in the morning, and by midday, we were well on our way toward Bermuda. The weather forecast had predicted clear skies for the next few days, and we had more than enough supplies. Spirits were high, and we spent the day talking, laughing, and enjoying the breeze. Sam even joked about the triangle, saying we might run into aliens or time warps. We all laughed it off. No one really took it seriously. No one except Joseph, who was more superstitious than the rest of us. Joseph had been quiet for most of the trip, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. At one point, he asked Nate, "You ever sail through here before?" Nate shrugged and said he had crossed the triangle a couple of times, but nothing weird had ever happened to him. Joseph didn't look convinced. "I just have a bad feeling," he muttered. None of us thought much of it at the time, but looking back, I wish we had listened. The second day, things started to change. The wind died down to a stillness that felt unnatural. The water was so calm it looked like glass, reflecting the sky like a mirror. There was no movement, no sound, just a thick, oppressive silence that made my skin crawl. It wasn't normal for the ocean to be that still, not in the open sea. We all felt it. Nate tried to make light of it, saying it was just one of those rare days, but I could see the tension building in him too. By nightfall, the air had gotten cold, much colder than it should have been for that time of year. We were still about 200 miles from Bermuda, and we hadn't seen another ship or plane all day. Not even a bird. It was like we had sailed into some void where nothing lived. That's when the strange fog rolled in. It started as a thin mist on the horizon, barely noticeable at first, but it grew quickly, creeping toward us like it had a mind of its own. I've seen fog before, but this was different. It moved unnaturally, swirling and thickening around us until we couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. The GPS on the boat started acting up, blinking in and out, showing impossible coordinates one moment and losing signal the next. Nate, who was usually calm in any situation, was growing frustrated, banging on the equipment, but nothing worked. Then came the noises. At first, I thought it was the wind picking up, but the air was dead still. It sounded like whispers, soft, indecipherable, and coming from everywhere at once. I looked at Sam and Joseph, and I could see from their faces that they heard it too. "What the hell is that?" Sam asked, his voice shaking. We all stood there on the deck, straining to listen, but the whispers just grew louder, more urgent, like a chorus of voices speaking all at once, but in no language any of us could understand. That's when the lights appeared in the fog. They were faint at first, distant flickers of yellowish white like lanterns swaying in the darkness. But they weren't stationary. They were moving, circling the boat, getting closer. Nate grabbed a flashlight and shone it into the mist, but it did nothing. The beam just disappeared into the fog. "Turn it off," Joseph said suddenly. "Turn it off now." Nate hesitated, but something in Joseph's voice made him obey. The fog was alive. It moved, twisting and swirling, as if it was watching us. The lights continued to circle and the whispers grew louder until it felt like they were inside my head, burrowing into my mind. I couldn't think straight. My heart was pounding, and I could feel a cold sweat trickling down my spine. Sam was gripping the railing so hard his knuckles turned white. I heard him whisper, "We're not alone." We all knew it. Something was out there, in the fog, watching us, playing with us. Suddenly, the boat jerked violently, like something had struck it from below. Nate rushed to the controls, trying to steady us. But it happened again. Another hard hit, this time from the side. "What's going on?" I shouted, but no one answered. Sam ran to the edge of the boat, peering into the water. His face went pale, and he stumbled back. "There's something in the water," he gasped. I looked over the edge, and my heart nearly stopped. Beneath the boat, I could see dark shapes moving, massive, shadowy figures just below the surface circling us. They were too large to be fish or dolphins. Whatever they were huge, and there were more than a few of them. The fog pressed in tighter, and I could feel the air growing colder by the second. The lights in the fog grew brighter, closer, until they seemed to hover just outside the boat. And then, all at once, the whispers stopped. The fog went silent, but the cold, eerie presence remained. Suddenly, without warning, the boat's engine roared to life. Nate hadn't touched the controls. The wheel spun on its own, and the boat lurched forward as if something was pulling it. We were moving fast, faster than the boat should have been able to go in such still water. We clung to whatever we could as the boat tore through the fog, but the lights followed, keeping pace with us, never falling behind. Then, as quickly as it had started, it all stopped. The fog lifted, and the lights vanished. We were back in the open sea, with the stars above us and the gentle rocking of the boat beneath our feet. The GPS blinked back to life, showing us only a few miles off course from Bermuda. But none of us said a word. We were too shaken, too terrified to speak. When we finally made it to Bermuda, we didn't stay long. We refueled the boat, stocked up on supplies, and left as soon as we could. None of us ever spoke about what happened in the Triangle. We all knew something unnatural had happened out there, but we didn't want to acknowledge it. Even now, years later, I still can't fully understand what we encountered that night. I've never been back to the Bermuda Triangle, and I never will. There are things out there, in that stretch of ocean, that we're not meant to understand. Things that watch, that wait, that play with us like toys. And I know, without a doubt, that whatever we encountered that night is still out there, waiting for the next unfortunate souls to drift into its domain. My name is Ian Rivers, and I live in Portland, Oregon. I was 28 years old when the most disturbing experience of my life unfolded. I was fresh out of college and had just landed a good job in the city, but my budget was tight, and finding affordable rent in Portland wasn't easy. I eventually found a modest, 2-story house on the outskirts of town, a place that seemed perfect, quiet, surrounded by trees, and far enough from the city to give me some peace. But it wasn't long after moving in that I realized something was wrong with the house, something I couldn't see but could definitely hear. The house was old, built sometime in the 1940s. It had a certain charm, with creaky wooden floors and high ceilings, but it was the attic that made me uncomfortable. Even during the daytime, it gave off a strange, unsettling vibe. It was cold, much colder than the rest of the house, even though it had no windows. The previous tenants had left some old furniture and boxes up there, gathering dust, and I didn't bother moving them out. I figured I'd leave them as they were. I was only in the house for a week when the noises started. At first, it was faint, just a few odd creaks in the middle of the night, something you could easily brush off as the house settling. But soon, the sounds grew louder and more distinct. It was like something, or someone, was up there walking across the floorboards dragging something heavy. I convinced myself it was just my imagination. An old house like this, it had to have strange noises, right? But every night, without fail, The sounds grew more deliberate. The heavy footsteps would start around midnight, slow and deliberate, moving from one end of the attic to the other. It didn't feel random. It was almost as if something was pacing, waiting. I tried to ignore it at first, thinking maybe it was raccoons or some other animal that had made its way inside. Portland was full of wildlife after all. One night around 2 a.m., I couldn't take it anymore. The footsteps were too loud, too unnervingly human. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way to the attic door. My heart was racing, but I had to check. I told myself I wouldn't sleep if I didn't. The wooden steps groaned under my weight as I ascended, and the moment I opened the attic door, the air hit me, a stale, icy gust that didn't belong in a space with no ventilation. I shone the flashlight around the attic, scanning the cluttered space. There was nothing, just the same old furniture, the same boxes, and a thick layer of dust covering everything. Yet, I could still feel it, the sense that something was wrong. The air felt oppressive, like it was pushing down on me. I was about to turn back when something caught my eye. One of the boxes in the corner had been disturbed, its lid slightly askew. I walked over, my heart pounding in my chest. I knelt down and lifted the lid. Inside was nothing but old clothes, yellowed with age. But beneath the clothes, I noticed something else. A thick, dark stain on the floorboards, like something had leaked there long ago. The stain was almost black, and it gave off a faint, rancid smell. I quickly replaced the lid, feeling uneasy, and hurried back downstairs. That night, I barely slept. The next morning, I called an exterminator, convinced it had to be some kind of animal. The guy came, checked the attic, and said he didn't see any signs of wildlife. No droppings, no nests, nothing. I even had him check the floor where the stain was, but he just shrugged and said it looked like old water damage. I thanked him and sent him on his way, but deep down, I knew there was more to it than that. The footsteps continued, growing louder each night. They didn't seem random anymore. It was as if whatever was up there knew when I was listening, taunting me. One night, the sounds were so loud it felt like they were coming from directly above my bedroom. I could hear it, the slow, deliberate creak of floorboards, followed by what sounded like dragging. I sat up in bed, every muscle in my body tense, and that's when I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible scraping sound coming from the ceiling. I froze. The noise was right above me, moving slowly across the ceiling as if something, or someone, was crawling just above my bed. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I was paralyzed with fear, listening as the scraping continued for what felt like hours before stopping abruptly. The next morning, I decided I had to get out of that house, but I couldn't just pack up and leave. I had signed a lease, and I didn't have the money to break it. I tried to spend more time out of the house, staying late at work, going to bars with friends, anything to avoid being there at night. But no matter how much time I spent away, I always had to come back. One night, after another sleepless evening of pacing sounds and dragging noises, I decided to confront whatever was up there. I didn't care if it was an animal, a ghost, or some intruder. I just wanted it to stop. Armed with a baseball bat and a flashlight, I climbed the attic stairs again. This time I wasn't leaving until I figured out what was going on. The attic was colder than ever, the air thick and stifling. I stood in the center of the room, shining the flashlight around, my breath visible in the freezing air. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The boxes and old furniture had been moved. Not much, but enough to notice. They were slightly shifted, like something had been navigating around them, and then in the far corner of the attic, I saw it. At first I thought it was a shadow, just another trick of the light. But as I stepped closer, the figure moved. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. It was crouched in the corner, a shape so dark it seemed to absorb the light. It was small, barely larger than a child, but its limbs were all wrong. Too long, too thin. I couldn't move. The creature slowly turned its head toward me, and that's when I saw its eyes. Two dull, milky orbs that reflected no light. It made no sound, just stared at me with those dead eyes. My body finally kicked into action, and I stumbled backward, nearly falling down the stairs in my panic. I slammed the attic door shut and ran down the stairs, locking myself in my bedroom. I didn't sleep that night. Over the next few days, I tried to rationalize what I had seen. Maybe it was a hallucination, maybe I was sleep deprived, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew it was real. I could feel it, that thing, still up there, waiting. I started hearing it during the day too. The same soft scraping, the same dragging sounds. I knew I couldn't stay in the house any longer. I contacted my landlord and told him there was something wrong with the attic. He seemed confused but agreed to send someone to check it out. The next day, a repairman came, a burly guy with a no-nonsense attitude. He climbed into the attic, grumbling the whole way, while I waited downstairs, my nerves shot. After about 15 minutes, he came back down, his face pale and shaken. "I'm not going back up there," he said, refusing to make eye contact. He didn't explain what he saw, and I didn't ask. I packed my bags that night and left. I didn't care about the lease or the money anymore. I just had to get out. It's been almost 2 years since I left that house, and I still think about it almost every day. I've tried to look up the history of the place, but I can't find much. No reports of hauntings, no strange deaths, nothing that would explain what was living in that attic. But whatever it wasn't human. And it's still there, waiting for the next tenant to move in, to listen to the footsteps at night, and to feel the cold air pressing in around them. I can only hope they leave before they see what I saw.